There are very few people in history who are seen as both a national savior and a mass murderer. But Mao Zedong, he's absolutely one of them. In China, he's the founding father, the man who unified the country. But to much of the world, he was a brutal dictator whose policies killed tens of millions of his own people. So how can both of those things be true? How can one man be both a hero and a monster? Well, let's get into it. And if you want to understand Mao, you have to start with quotes like this. Seriously, death is truly joyful. He wasn't joking. This gives you a peek into a mind that put the revolution above absolutely everything else, including human life. It perfectly sums up the chilling, contradictory nature of the man we're talking about today. All right, so to really unpack this guy, we're going to break down his story into 6 parts. We'll start with his early days as a farmer's son, trace his insane journey to power, look at the country he built, the chaos he unleashed, the man behind the myth, and finally, the complicated legacy he left behind. So, part 1, let's go right back to the beginning. I mean, how does a kid from a rural village end up as the leader of one of the biggest communist revolutions ever? For Mao, it really came down to a rebellious spirit and being in the right place at the right time to hear some very radical new ideas. Mao was born back in 1893, and his dad was a pretty tough farmer, which probably explains why Mao learned to defy authority from a young age. As a teenager, he got swept up in the excitement when the revolution toppled China's last emperor. But the real game changer for him was getting a job as a library assistant in Beijing. It was there that he first got his hands on the writings of Karl Marx, and boom, a fire was lit. By 1921, he wasn't just a reader, he was a founding member of the brand new Communist Party of China. But, starting a political party, that turned out to be the easy part. What came next was a brutal, 2-decade-long civil war that would push Mao to his limits and show the world just how brilliant and how ruthless he could be. Okay, so you had 2 main players in this fight. On one side, you've got the nationalists, led by Chiang Kai-shek. They were the official government, controlling the big cities. On the other side were Mao's communists. Their power base wasn't in the cities. It was out in the countryside with the peasants, and they got really good at guerrilla warfare. The whole thing kicked off in 1927, when Chiang suddenly turned on his communist allies and tried to wipe them out. Now, Mao's early attempts at military action were not great. They were pretty much failures. But his big moment, the one that made him a legend, came in 1935. With his army facing total destruction, he led them on what became known as the Long March. It was this insane, year-long retreat across thousands of kilometers. Most of his soldiers died. It was absolutely brutal. But it was also a stroke of propaganda genius. By the time it was over, Mao had created this incredible story of survival and sacrifice, and he came out of it as the unquestioned, undisputed leader of the party. After a quick timeout to fight off the Japanese in World War II, the Civil War fired right back up. And by 1949, Mao had won. He stood in Beijing and declared the founding of the People's Republic of China. Now, the real challenge began: how to rebuild an entire nation from the ground up. And his plan for doing that was something called Maoism. It was his own special twist on Marxism. See, traditional Marxists focused on the urban factory workers as the heroes of the revolution. But Mao, he said no. The real power, the real revolutionary spirit, lies with the peasants, the exact people he grew up with. That one shift in focus would change everything for China. It didn't take long for Mao to show his darker side. In 1957, he launched the 100 Flowers campaign. He said, "Let 100 flowers bloom," basically encouraging people, especially intellectuals, to speak up and criticize the government. It sounded great, right? Free speech, but it was a trap. As soon as people voiced their real opinions, they were rounded up, punished, and purged. The message was sent loud and clear: do not cross me. And that absolute intolerance for any kind of criticism is what made the next phase of his rule possible. He was about to launch these massive, radical social experiments to try and build his perfect communist society. But these experiments would have an almost unimaginable human cost. First up, in 1958, was the Great Leap Forward. This was his wild plan to turn China into an industrial superpower, like, overnight. He abolished all private farms. He forced millions of people into these huge military-style communes. The goal was to produce massive amounts of steel and grain. The ambition was off the charts, but the plan itself was a complete and utter disaster. The result wasn't a great leap forward. It was a total collapse of the food system. This led to the single worst famine in all of recorded human history. The estimated number of people who starved to death is around 38 million. Just let that number sink in for a second. 38 million. After a disaster that big, Mao's power started to slip. So what did he do? He launched the Cultural Revolution. He basically empowered an army of radicalized students, his Red Guards, and told them to go out and destroy anything old or traditional. This was his way of purging his political rivals and reasserting his total control. It was a decade of pure chaos. They banned everything from tight pants and long hair to practicing your own religion. It was a war on the past itself. So while all this public turmoil was going on, Mao's private life was like a state secret, locked away from view. The image the public saw was one thing, but the reality behind closed doors was something else entirely. This is the Mao everyone was supposed to see. The propaganda showed him as the great helmsman, wise, calm, a dignified father figure guiding the massive ship of China through stormy seas. He was basically presented as a living god. But then, years later, his personal doctor published a tell-all book, and the picture it painted was, well, very different. He described a man who was a chain smoker, who was hooked on powerful sleeping pills, and who had countless sexual partners. Now, of course, some of these claims are debated, but they suggest a man who was far more rustic, crude, and complex than the perfect image sold to the public. Mao finally died in 1976. He left behind a country that was totally transformed, but also deeply, deeply traumatized. So the big question is, how do people think of him today? Well, as you might imagine, it's really complicated. His legacy is really split right down the middle. On the one hand, he gets credit for unifying China after what they call the Century of Humiliation, when foreign powers basically ran the country. His supporters will point out that literacy rates and life expectancy shot up under his rule. He also did a lot to advance women's rights. But then there's the other side of the ledger. He's criticized for his absolute totalitarian rule, for creating a terrifying cult of personality around himself, and for policies that, as we saw, killed millions and millions of people, not to mention the brutal political purges and the destruction of so much priceless culture and history. So where does that leave us? What's the final call? Was he the revolutionary hero who saved China? Or was he one of history's most monstrous tyrants? Maybe the most difficult, most unsettling answer is that he was somehow both. And that's a contradiction that China and the rest of the world is still trying to figure out.